It's 2025 and a new year means brand new opportunities. And for a lot of you out there, I know you've been thinking about one thing over the holidays, and that is starting your own business. But you have so many questions like how do I get started? How do I come up with a brand? How do I even sell stuff to people? And what am I even going to sell? Now take a deep breath. Shopify has got you. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And you can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. You don't have to be a coding nerd or a design geek to get this done. All you need to do is drag and drop. Shopify also helps with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, so you can focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/truecrime, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/truecrime to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/truecrime.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my serial co-host, Brett.
I mean, I am your co-host in every episode, so I guess that works.
It's a serial thing.
It is a serial thing. We're a serialized podcast, so it's perfect.
But Brett, as always, serial has nothing to do with you, and this podcast today has nothing to do with you or me because we are joined by the incredible Julia Cowley, retired FBI agent, who is just one of the most interesting people I think we've ever had on the show. And I didn't get the honor of being on the show with her last time because, thank you, Julia, I was taking care of my baby and you stepped in to do a legal briefs with Brett. So thank you for coming back on the show, and thank you for joining us today as we talk about the latest breaking serial killer news.
And I just want to say it's the most popular legal briefs we ever did is Julia's episode. So we're really excited to have her back, particularly on this case, a case that she knows a lot about.
I do. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be back. And I mean, everybody is fascinated with profiling, but one of the things I try to do is dispel some of the myths about it. So I'm not really that exciting. Everyone's like, oh, really? That's not good. That's not exciting.
That's absolutely exciting. And it fits perfectly with what we try to do, right? We are called the cold water prosecutors because we wanted to dispel myths. And I loved that about your episode because it's important work. And the truth is just as exciting as, honestly, all the, fantasy around it. But it's so much more important that we know what the facts are and what's rooted in reality. Otherwise, if you can't even decide what truth is, then there's a lot lost in this world.
Right. And you don't have any credibility as well. If you're not honest about what you know, what you don't know, what you can do with a criminal investigative analysis, what you can't, the pros and cons, basically. And you're not always going to be right. And I've said that over and over again. You can't always be right. Some people think they are, but guarantee they're not.
And Julia, just in case anyone missed the Legal Briefs episode with you, can you give us like a 15-second background of who you are and why everything you say today is going to trump everything Brett and I say today?
Well, I'm Julia Cowley. I'm a retired FBI agent, and I was also a certified profiler in the FBI. Really, we don't call ourselves profilers in the FBI. We are certified in behavioral analysis. So, but everybody knows it as profilers. So we just say that. And I have a background in forensic science. Prior to joining the FBI, I was a forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which is where I got my start in law enforcement. It's a great agency. The experience I got there was invaluable. So that's a little bit of my background. Most of my career before going into the behavioral analysis unit, I was working public corruption and civil rights. And I was also on the evidence response team. So part of getting into the behavioral analysis unit was based on my white collar background, because we were doing a lot of research on high level white collar offenders at the time. So I had a good combination of violent crime background from my crime scene work and white collar background from my investigative background in the FBI.
And one thing I want to mention that somehow went unmentioned the last time we had Julia on the show is she is also a podcaster. It has a show called The Consult, which has a lot of great episodes you guys should be listening to. It's been on a bit of a hiatus, but we're hoping it'll come back soon with new stuff. I have more to say about that in the coming months. But if you haven't listened to her, anybody out there who's listened to our last Legal Briefs episode, and I'm sure after you finish this one, you know how great she is. So insightful. She likes to put me in my place when it comes to behavioral analysis, which I know so many of you enjoy. So I hope you guys will check out her podcast as well. But today, we're here to talk about a case that's had a lot of speculation that turned out to all be wrong. So I'm curious to know, Julia, as a, if you don't want me to call you a profiler, as a member of the behavioral analysis unit, had I don't know if I want to call it the pleasure, but had the opportunity to work on this case. So obviously the breaking news today is that a suspect has been arrested in the Long Island serial killer case. It's probably one of the biggest cases in the last 20 years, one of the most prolific serial killers of recent vintage, a case that really took a lot of people by storm. There's a great book out there called Lost Girls, if you haven't read it. Fantastic book that really focuses on the victims, which is a different perspective than you often hear, and it's really good. There's been movies made about this, documentaries made about this. The Killing Season is a documentary. It's on Hulu. It's a very good one, a little dated now, but it just had a ton of focus and was one of those cases that people thought this one will never be solved for a lot of different reasons. But today there was an arrest. And so I guess my first question for you, Julia, was, did it come as a surprise to you that the person who was arrested is a sort of well-to-do, established businessman in New York and the head of an architectural firm with a wife and 2 kids, everyday American, living the normal sort of upper middle class, maybe even wealthy lifestyle? And here we are with him charged with 3 counts of murder, which will likely become 4, if not more like 10 in the days and months to come.
Every single point we hit on. No, we didn't know he was in architecture. However, generally, when we learned about who he was, what his background was, we were not surprised based on our initial analyses. So we were involved in this case very early on in 2000, when they first found the bodies. And what I want to explain is that my involvement, I was not the lead on this case. This case was assigned to Bob Drew, who's also does the podcast, The Consult, with me. He's one of my co-hosts. So he was the lead on this. And I assisted him along with another one of my co-hosts, Susan Kostler. So that's generally how it works in the BAU. Somebody is the lead and the others assist. And we all kind of work together to come to a consensus based on what we are told and know at the time. So we were involved pretty early on. And some of what we noticed based on where the victims were found, their victimologies, how they were contacted, and what we knew. And it was very little, to be honest. This was a difficult case because there's no crime scene and you don't have that interaction between the offender and victim that tells you so much. We had some interaction that we knew. Some of it we had to speculate to, but based on what we knew, we came up with a very kind of preliminary initial profile, sort of. And when I say profile, it was just sort of thoughts and impressions. That's kind of what it is. We don't necessarily, hit on every single detail about the offender, but just sort of impressions about the crime. And so, no, the way he turned out to be, the suspect at least fits the profile. And when I say that, a lot of people would fit the profile.
Can you, and that's incredible background, can you kind of walk us through what you knew about, I know the victimology, there was very little information from that, but for those who may not know about this case, can you give us just a little bit of background of what you knew at the time, at the very beginning when you did this first analysis of the profile that you were coming up with?
Right. Well, we knew that these bodies, they were found on Gilgo Beach, and they were wrapped, and they were bound and wrapped. And so there was an attempt to hide them, but it wasn't, in terms of the attempt, it wasn't like they were buried or anything. So it was just mostly brought there already with the attempt to hide them. So that's what we knew. We knew that the initial victims that were being found, when they were identified, that they were known to be missing, that they worked in the sex industry. They advertised on Craigslist. They had been contacted. We knew about that the offender, that there was a witness that the offender may drive a high-end like SUV type vehicle. I can't remember specifically if we knew the make and model, but we knew that, and that they were called and these dates were arranged. We knew also, we learned at some point in time that some of these calls had been made in New York City or from the city. So we were sort of, getting some idea of, okay, somebody's calling the victims through their work, meeting up with them, killing them in some way, and then taking the time to wrap them up and hide their bodies and then go dispose of them. So that is generally what we knew. And really that's really what the public knew at the time as well, as in the information that's come out. It really hasn't changed that much in terms of what we knew back at the time.
And can you kind of walk us through, obviously you may have a lot of victims that come to you. How do you determine that this may be the work of one person rather than individual acts by different people?
So we're looking at just similarities, like that are just uncanny kind of similarities that connect them to crime behaviorally. Again, we didn't have a ton of behavior because we didn't have a crime scene. But what we did have is we had victims that were wrapped up and disposed of similarly. They were contacted similarly. Their victimologies were the same. And so those initial three now that he's been charged with, and I believe likely will be a fourth charge, were likely connected because of that. The other victims, and some of them were dismembered, there just wasn't enough there to connect them in terms of their backgrounds, or there's some similarities, but it is possible that there was another killer or multiple other killers, but there's just not enough to say. But that's kind of how you start to kind of piece together. You're looking for similar behavior patterns across the series. And we just thought it was just too coincidental they were found, their locations, they were very close together as well. The timing of them, the fact that they occurred during, went missing during warmer weather, factored in to these, could be potentially connected as well. And we always say, we never say, we always say it's likely, or we don't ever we're not definitive, because you really cannot be. And you can't, I think one of the biggest myths, you have people that don't believe in behavioral analysis at all. They just think it's complete junk science. And I understand why they think that. Then you have others that think it's the be all end all. But one of the biggest myths for the people that think it's the be all end all is that you can identify a perpetrator through behavioral analysis. You cannot. It cannot be done. It can help. It can help prioritize people as potential suspects until you can rule them out. And it can help with investigative strategies. It can help with interview strategies and things like that, but it can't identify a perpetrator. But in this case, we thought that there's likely at least a linkage between those first four.
So, yeah, they're sort of, it's kind of like Jack the Ripper, right? I think in Jack the Ripper, there are 5 canonical victims, and then there are multiple people who were killed in similar manners in London at the time, and people argue over whether or not those are the same thing. The Atlanta child murders is another one where it's quite clear that, I can't even remember his name right now, but he killed a good number of people, but probably not everyone that's attributed to him. And in this case, I think people are surprised by the level of depravity in society sometimes, and they just can't believe that, there are 10 women found within a pretty short distance of each other, all of whom are involved in sex work to some extent, well, it must all be the same killer. What are the chances there are two killers? There might be three killers or four killers, I mean, for all we know. And then Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose death really led to this, I think most people think that even though it was her death and, her mother's quest to get justice for her that led to the finding of all these bodies, she's probably not related at all, and in fact may have been an accident. So what do you say to that as far as people who just have a difficult time believing that all of these murders are not connected to one killer?
First of all, in kind of the New York area, in certain areas, sometimes killers find good places to dump bodies. That happened in Boston with mob killings. A bunch of bodies are buried near each other. And in New York City, it is hard to hide a body. So if you find a place, and I think, as crazy as it sounds, as coincidental, it is possible that not all of them are related. They might all be related. I understand it. Coincidentally, it's hard to think that these all are not related because they are so close together. But it is a good place. Can be fairly isolated, particularly in the winter, but it is a good place to just dump a body. And so that's what I say. And then also I would say that, serial murder, it is rare. And I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but of all murders that happen in a year, it's like, it accounts for probably less than 1%. So what we're forgetting is that vulnerable people, vulnerable victims are in chronic danger. If we're just all going to jump to the conclusion, oh, it's a serial murder when women go missing, or vulnerable people go missing, then we're sort of forgetting, or I guess we're discounting the chronic danger that people really are in at all times. And those of us that are not in chronic danger maybe can't relate or don't necessarily want to. And they think, oh, it must be a serial killer. But in this case, I cannot say with certainty that these are not all linked, because they're just, at least at the time that our team looked at it, we just could not see enough. Now, that was a long time ago, and the investigation continued, techniques have developed, so they may have more information than we had at the time. And we're all retired, so we're not going to get that like we used to. So, but at the time, behaviorally, there just wasn't enough. And at the time, they didn't have the forensic evidence either.
You just said something that I found so poignant, and I just wanted to underline it. I think, it's absolutely right that when you have many victims, or you find many kind of murder victims in close proximity or in a similar fashion, people often like to jump to serial killer. And while that may be what we have here, I thought what you said was so important. We fear when there's a serial killer. We're like, oh, there's a serial killer on the loose, we are in danger. But in fact, what you're saying is, by jumping to the conclusion that it may be a serial killer, we're actually leaving vulnerable victims, vulnerable populations at more risk, because we are not aware that there are so many more people who could carry out these actions than just the one potential serial killer. And I just thought that was so interesting that, the fear is usually around the serial killer. When will this serial killer strike again? But in fact, by maybe focusing on only serial killers, that we kind of lose the fact that there are many depraved in our society who are capable of doing what we ascribe to, say, a serial killer. So that was just fascinating to me. And I'd love to, if you could talk through kind of y'all's dialogue, the three of you, or what you were thinking of with such limited information, to kind of come up with a profile that ended up being spot on.
Yeah, I actually have some of my notes here just to refresh my memory, but in some of it, people will just be like, well, duh, of course. But first and foremost, we thought he would be from Long Island, familiar with the area. And, sometimes when you start off with like those simple things, and detectives laugh at you like, okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. Glad we called you.
Let me interrupt you there and just ask you a question, because I'm not real familiar with the geography, and other people may not be as well. I guess he is from Massapequa. Is that how you pronounce where he's from?
Yes.
The bodies are dumped in Gilgo Beach. Do you think the connection to Gilgo Beach was as simple as it was a good dumping place?
No, I think he'd probably been there before. And it could be visited there, vacation, or potentially driving around to find a good place. But I would think he was very comfortable there. I mean, that's a lot of, that's a big
So
risk.
it's 23 miles about,
23.
I'm sorry, 23 minutes about 19 miles. So
Okay.
very
I was
close.
going to, I've driven through Long Island before, and then sometimes it just takes you forever to get, very short distance. But I would think he'd been there before, particularly, our thought was probably not living right there, but he's probably from the area of Long Island. And we thought white male, it's a myth that all serial killers are white males. We know that, but we just thought generally because of the victims, because of the area.
What about the victims made you think that? Was it because of their, line of work? Did they have similar backgrounds, the way they looked? What made you think that the victims led you to think this person their murderer was a white male?
Because they were white, and at least the ones we were looking at the time, white victims. And I'm not saying he was exclusive, but that would just seem to be statistically. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have seen, killings cross racial boundaries. But that was, again, we base this on statistics. And so it was just statistically because of the area, because of the demographics of the area, because of the victims. So just thought most likely a white male, somewhere between, this, really tight age range between mid-20s to mid-40s, I think is what we thought. It was really hard to say. However, we were leaning toward him being a little bit older, because what we felt he was doing, he was at the very least, he was presenting himself as affluent. So he had this nice SUV. He was contacting the victims by phone. He seemed to be smart, articulate. We thought he was likely a businessman. That was one of the things we said. We obviously didn't say architect, but it's somebody with business, because we knew some of the calls had originated, the calls that were part of this crime had originated in New York City. So we thought this was likely a businessman who was on Long Island, but would travel to New York for work, would travel into the city. And so that made him maybe a little bit older, again, educated, because we thought he was probably, a professional and educated. We thought he had probably pretty good social skills. He was calling the victims, convincing them to meet with him, or, arranging meetings. And so he was comfortable with that, comfortable with calling and talking with people. You'll see offenders who they have no ability to talk. They don't want to talk. They don't try to talk. It's blitz attack. And this wasn't that. This was somebody calling on the phone and using verbal skills to some extent. So we thought he would be social. And
let me ask you this, because there's one thing about this case that is different, or maybe not different, but certainly new from older cases, and was one reason. If you had asked me, I would have said I thought he was younger, and that's the use of the internet. There was Craigslist and Backpage or whatever. I mean, that's how these girls were advertising. He was finding them there. He wasn't picking them up on the street or whatever. And what sort of role would the use of the internet? Because I would have thought younger guys, somebody who's more comfortable with the internet. So I was a little surprised to see that he was older. What did you think about that, or did that play sort of any factor into what you were thinking?
I don't think that played a factor, not at least with what I was thinking at the time. I was just really focused on at least with two victims, I believe, I thought he was picking them up in the city and bringing them to Long Island, bringing them somewhere. And the crime scene is somewhere else, is not on the beach there. And so he had a place to go. And, you think about probably a place where he had privacy and was able to do what he did. And, whatever, we don't know how they were murdered, but sexually assaulted them, murdered them, but then took the time, which we know for a fact, we took the time to wrap them up. And so we had to have a place for that. So I was sort of thinking, and I think my colleagues were thinking this as well, that, if he had a place to go, he likely had his own home. And so therefore maybe a little on the older range of that age. I guess that's how I was viewing it. But as you can see, it could, somebody else could have viewed it the way that you view it, Brett, and that would be reasonable. And then in terms of him possibly being a businessman, and it all kind of starts to fall together, and, businessman, professional, going into the city, coming back, having a place, possibly married. I think we said he was married or had a girlfriend.
What about that? I'm so curious. Everything you're saying, you may think that it's like everybody knows, but everything you're saying, I'm like,
that's what I think.
Oh!
I think anyone could also have a different viewpoint. Like,
well,
Brett.
But why did you think he had a
why
girlfriend
did you think
or
he
was
was married? Yeah, I mean that's fascinating to me. You were right.
I don't know. Just lucky. No. Well, I think it just had to do with his, as we were discussing it, and it was kind of taking shape and forming, and okay, he's a businessman. He goes into the city. That's where he's picking up people and doing his things that his family may not know about. And then he's coming back home, and he, just because statistically he's probably married. I guess it's just more along those lines. Most people that, I don't know what the statistics are, but I guess maybe from my perspective, and, and that's why profiling is not always exact, because everybody
Did it have to do with the fact that he was contacting women for like a paid service rather than, say, just going out dating? Because if you didn't have wife, maybe you would just go to a bar and pick up a girl, as opposed to go a more covert way of meeting women.
Yeah. I think he didn't have the opportunity to go out to the bars, but this was just, I guess, an easier way where he didn't have to spend a lot of time out somewhere trying to socialize and get somebody that way. But I really thought it was more just the thought of, okay, you have somebody who's potentially living here, traveling. They probably have their own home where they were able to have privacy to commit their crime and cover up that crime. And then they could leave to go dispose the bodies. And I guess just thinking along those lines, that is likely somebody who could very well be married, just based on being a little bit older in our minds. But as you could see, that could have been wrong, but that's not how we saw it at the time. And I just think it was just how it sort of developed as we talked about it. Like, well, most likely he had a place, like a garage or something where he could do this, and he had some privacy. And Long Island is a lot of single family homes, and people who own single family homes tend to have, jobs and tend to have families. And I think that's how we were viewing it.
Okay. So for those of you who don't know, we talked about the arrest today. There was a press conference. We've had some evidence that was laid out. A couple things that came up. There's some DNA evidence here. There were hairs from a woman that were found on the victims that were not the victim and were not related to the victim. Sounds like there was probably some genetic genealogy done here. And his wife, the hairs actually came from his wife. There were also hairs from a man. They were able to locate DNA from a pizza box, I guess, that they were able to connect there. So that's pretty strong. But the thing that is most interesting to me, and I think where Julia can come in, is the cell phone evidence, some of which included phone calls from one of the victim's phones to her family. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that before? And what does that tell you?
I have not seen that in cases that I've worked on. So that is rare from my experience, and that an offender will call a victim's family. So I did work on the Golden State Killer. Joe D'Angelo was arrested for that, and they suspected that he called victims after the assaults. And I don't know if it was really him or not. I don't think there's ever been conclusive proof that it was him. So that's probably the closest I've ever seen. And I just wasn't convinced. I didn't think that there was enough to say, yeah, I think he did that. In this case, we know he was using a victim's phone to call a victim's family. And I have not seen that. But knowing that, that is a very sadistic person. And I viewed that, and I think my team viewed it as, somebody who's wanting in his own way. It's like taking a trophy and remembering it, continuing to the torture that, he started with his victims. And he really, to do that is just, it's just horrific. And so this was a way, I think he was kind of reliving things, much like sometimes, not all killers take souvenirs or trophies. Some do. Some can rely on their memories. But I think this was his way of kind of doing that, reliving it. And at least that was what I viewed it. And it's extremely sadistic. And I think the offender that did this really enjoyed, their pain and their suffering and scaring them. I mean, why else do it? There's no other reason to do something like that. And, most offenders that I've seen, once they kill their victims, they're done and they don't try to contact the families. And I'm sure there's a case out there where that has happened, but not on any cases that I've worked on myself.
Another thing that I think has interested a lot of people, and I realize this is speculation, but it seems like, I believe the police said they found 7 burner phones. Burner phones were one of the ways they connected him to this case. And some of the they were actually, they were able to tail him to a store where he put more minutes on a burner phone, one of the ones he was using, which in fact he was using to do things like do Google searches on the case. But my understanding is I think there are 7 burner phones, and he used, and this is what I've heard, one burner phone was used for each victim for the 4. It was like a different burner phone was used for the 4 to contact them. And so that's led some people to suspect 7 phones, 7 victims. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't think I can speculate. It's possible. I mean, I am sure that the investigators are looking at everything to try to see if there's any other victims out there, to connect the ones that have already been found. And hopefully they can identify the ones that haven't been identified. But then if there's anybody else out there, but I don't know. I don't think I can say. What I can say is it would not surprise me if there were no other victims, and it would not surprise me if there were several more victims. Sorry.
No. I mean, that's look, I mean, like as you said, some people think behavioral analysis is magic, and we're always kind of skeptical of it. So, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on this. The other question I'll ask about it, one thing that led people to think maybe this would never be solved is it seemed like there was a spree of killings between about 2007 and maybe 2011 or so, maybe a little bit later. The bodies, I believe, were found in maybe 2012, 2013. They started finding bodies. And then it seemed like there weren't any. And so there were people who thought he'd moved, or maybe he was a transient, or maybe he was a trucker, and all this other stuff, or maybe he died, or maybe he went to prison. Well, it doesn't seem like any of that happened. And it doesn't seem like he's killed anybody in the last 10 years. Is that surprising to you?
No, that's not surprising to me either. And there could be a number of reasons. I mean, he stopped killing because he had a plan in place. And in some ways it was discovered when the victims were discovered, and that was his dump site, and he had it all set up, and he doesn't really know anything else. That's where he's from. So he's got to probably move somewhere else. So I think he probably just realized, I have to stop for now. And, if he didn't stop, then he's come up with a different plan of some sort, but I don't know. I guess I can't really say, but to answer your question, it does not surprise me, or it would not surprise me if he just stopped. I mean, he's not stupid in the sense of he's criminally sophisticated. He was probably keeping track of these cases in this investigation, and he knew enough to stop, and he was able to stop. This isn't something he wasn't able to control. And so, for his own self-preservation, which somebody like this, it's all about him, he likely stopped and probably was living out his fantasies in other ways to compensate for that, through maybe pornography or sexual encounters that didn't result in homicide.
The timeline is kind of all over the place because I know several victims were not found until many years later. Do you think it had to do with the release of the news? Were there killings up until that time and they stopped? Or I can't remember back to about 10 years ago or 13 years ago when when there was a lot of news coverage about it. But were there killings
Right.
up to the point that it became public?
Yes. So, yeah, I think he stopped because it became public. Absolutely. Yeah, it seemed to be that way, that there were no more that we know of.
And you
So
said
we still don't know for sure. That's the thing.
Sure. And you said something that I found really interesting. You said he was able to stop. Can you go into that a little bit more? Is that something that you find within serial killers? Why do you say, you chose those words specifically? He was able to stop. To me, that sounds like someone who, like you said, is incredibly sadistic. Like he has control over every part of him. He's very educated. He's used to controlling other things in his life, like running a business or being someone who has control, right? It's not like this is his only outlet of control. But that's me, who's not a behavioral analyst. So I'd love to hear why you seized on that point that he was able to stop killing.
I think that maybe back in the early days of behavioral analysis, people say, well, these killers can't stop. They can't control themselves. And that's just not what we found. We found that they do tend to stop, and they stop for a lot of different reasons that don't include death or imprisonment, but they will stop because they get busy with life. They get older, they age out, it's tiresome, it's hard. And they may have another outlet that they can somehow live out their fantasies in another way, or just self-preservation. They're too close to getting caught and they know they have to stop. This is not something that this killer couldn't control. So that's why I say that this is somebody who knows what right from wrong. They have, generally these types of crimes are based on fantasy. They have these fantasies. They want to act out these fantasies and they can't do it in their normal everyday life. So they go out and find these victims, but there are things in place that will get them to stop if they need to, particularly if they're about if they think they're going to get caught, and especially as you mentioned, Alice, he at the very least, I'm not going to say he was successful because I don't know how successful he was, and that will remain to be seen. But when we did this initial analysis, he wants to portray the perception that he's successful. So this would sort of, I guess, make that success all come crashing down if he were to be found out. I think that's important to him. Probably wants to be looked at as this, very smart, successful businessman, and getting caught would, ruin that. So probably it was just like, I better stop. They're getting too close. And I'm sure that at least partially, he was looking for other outlets, maybe even contemplating, well, maybe I'll try a different plan. But those things can take time. And whether he was able to act out on another plan, I think that'll remain to be seen.
I want to ask a dumb question.
Go ahead.
Well, the first question I don't think is dumb. According to the press conference, he committed these crimes while his wife was out of the country.
Yes, I did hear that. Yeah.
Is that pretty consistent with what you would imagine that would be sort of the time that he would act?
Yeah. And I think that at the time, I remember we were talking about, because they were summertime, maybe his family was gone during that time. That was just what we speculated about. But yeah.
So my dumb question, which I don't know if it's a dumb question, but it's a question people always ask. So if you ask this question on Facebook in our groups, I'm not calling you dumb, but motive. So, one thing that people struggle with in all these cases is motive, whether it's Richard Allen or Brian Koberger or this guy or any of the various cases we cover. People always struggle with motive. Like, why would you do something like this? And they put themselves in those shoes through the lens of their lives. And obviously they can't think of any reason you'd murder people. And that's a good thing, because we don't want people to think it's rational to murder people. However, having said all that, this guy has it all. Right? He's got a successful business. He has a wife. He has 2 kids. He's got multiple properties. He has money. He's, he is successful. He's esteemed, whatever. What drives someone like that, to kill people?
Well, it's certainly sexual, power, control, success. I mean, I think that'll remain to be seen, like how successful he is. I mean, that might be being played up a little bit, but yeah, I mean, just sexual power, control. They want to have it. They want to take it. I think at some point that, these violent sexual fantasies sort of take over in his head in some way, and he wants to live them out. And it is gratifying to some people, like this offender in this case, to hurt people, to see them in pain, to see them afraid. That is sexually exciting and sexually gratifying. And it is hard to understand. I don't understand it. Logically, I kind of know it. That's how people are. But I don't really quite understand it myself. And I don't know what causes it. I think there's just kind of a combination of, your biology, your psychology, your how you're socialized. I think that's just a combination. I don't think there's one cause of someone becoming a serial killer.
How do you have that inside of you? And for a very long time, I mean, this guy is middle-aged. I'm not exactly how old he is. How do you have that inside of you? And for this long, have a life where, I mean, we're early days yet, but there's no obvious signs. The guy has no criminal history, no history of violence that we know of.
And adding to that, we don't know for sure, but potentially having a very not violent relationship with his wife or other women in his life in a way that doesn't draw attention to the fact that he could be a perpetrator.
Like how does that work?
He's just very good at masking it. That's, I mean, people walk around all the time with deep, dark secrets and nobody ever knows. And not even people that are closest to them will even catch on. So it is just the ability to probably compartmentalize, mask. He's probably very good at, not probably good at lying, manipulating people, and creating, and I keep using the word perception, just creating this perception. He wants you to think he's a certain way. And this is likely what he does. And I would still be surprised if there wasn't something that somebody looks back on and says, I always have a really hard time thinking there wasn't a warning sign or something. Not necessarily that someone's going to say, oh, I knew he was a serial killer, but some of these traits were probably seen by people that knew him, and those that were closest to him probably did recognize some of these things. These controlling is probably what would be the most noticeable. And, part of it could be kind of overcompensation as well for not feeling like he's in control enough. So again, trying to seem like, he's just this really good businessman and very smart and accomplished. And so, that was important to him, I think, to be viewed that way.
Let me ask you this additional question.
Yeah.
So one thing, when they looked at the burner phone, and we have linked to the bail filing that the state made about why he shouldn't get bail in this chat. If you go into the whatever the show notes of this chat, you can see that. I encourage all of you to read it, if for no other reason than to see the searches that he made on his phone involving child pornography, because Alice and I talk about how there are so many people, child predators amongst us. And I will just tell you that those searches are mild in comparison to what we have seen before in our cases. So let that haunt your dreams tonight. But that is sort of an angle here. What do you think that the connection is to sort of that sort of deviancy to the murders themselves?
I would just say it's just probably the spectrum of deviance. It's probably just not one type of deviance he's interested in. And perhaps these victims weren't young enough. And so, I mean, I haven't read this document, so I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. Like, just because you have one selection of victim doesn't mean you might not be interested in potentially other types of victims with other types of characteristics. And I mean, that's very dangerous. And potentially, I mean, I hadn't even really thought of this, but maybe targeting children in was just maybe seemed easier to him, or maybe these victims weren't quite young enough and he wanted to go with a younger victim as well. I mean, there's could be a number of reasons. Yeah.
And I'll bring up something you said previously, Julia, that rang a bell in my head. You said that perhaps he found a different outlet when he had to stop killing because it was made public. And we don't know enough about when this child pornography searching started. It would be really interesting if it actually did not coincide with the murders. Like you were saying, if he were successful in kind of channeling whatever drive he needed, whatever power he needed fulfilled. And, with these victims, of course, we don't know who all the victims are, but I think they tended to be quite young, on the lower end of the 20s, maybe even younger, and they tend to be very petite. So they even looked, smaller than the average adult. I think many of them were around 5 feet, maybe even smaller. Is that right, Julia?
They were small. I don't remember their exact size. And they were younger. They were 22 to 25, I think. Yeah. So they were younger. Yeah.
Which would
but
fit what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in the channeling, you talk about channeling his, fantasy life, or maybe, I guess, since he can't go out and kill right now because he's under a microscope, he's looking at pornography and he's, fulfilling his fantasies in other ways. Yeah, that's exactly right, Alice.
Well, that's just going to be really interesting, how the child pornography actually fits in rather than as a maybe complete separate deviancy. They may be intertied, like you were saying. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see, and also incredibly disturbing because we often, and this from your time in the FBI, unfortunately, child predators are all among us, and child porn cases are shockingly numerous. But almost all of the child porn cases that I have worked on have been kind of sad sacks who have no criminal record and don't touch people, don't like to talk to people, have, often social disorders, even, in that they are able to live this different alternate life online and are not, the outgoing, suave person in real life. And when we catch them and, prosecute them, that is typically, in my experience, all I've had to prosecute them for. Child porn. It hasn't been child porn plus a violent crime, unless it has to do with making the child porn, which is typically, honestly, a family member or someone they know, as opposed to going out and hunting for a victim that they have no connection to. And so I think that's really interesting in this case, because even on the child porn side, he doesn't fit what I am used to seeing on the child porn perpetrators.
Right. It could be too that in terms of like his fantasy life, he may want to look at child pornography, but he doesn't want to be a hands-on offender with a child. He wants to have a hands-on, interaction with an adult female or a young adult female. And that, fantasy worlds are very complicated. We're never going to know what's going on in someone else's head. And certainly they don't ever tell us the whole truth. Imagine telling your sexual fantasies out to everybody. Nobody does that. And certainly, these serial sexual killers are not going to do that. But that could be purely fantasy. It could be him, contemplating a hands-on offense. It's hard to say. But I do think, the references of the searches is likely some kind of compensation for, not being able to go out and commit crimes, or just supplementing in between.
Let me ask you this, and you may not even know the answer to this, and this may be another dumb question. When you see someone like this who has this sort of innate deviancy, do you tend to see something in their past, whether it's abuse, something from their childhood, that leads to this? Do you ever look at sort of what the ultimate, cause is a strong word, but what the sort of ultimate factors are that lead to create someone who can do this kind of thing? Because obviously most people can never imagine doing anything like this, much less being a serial killer and doing it multiple times.
Yes, of course. We're like, how did they end up this way? And there is just no one single cause. Everyone's background is very different. There does tend to be, I shouldn't even say it this way, but many offenders do have their own abuse in their background, whether it's emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse. That tends to be in some of their backgrounds, but some you just see nothing. And maybe it's because no one ever noticed or people are not talking. Others, you do see some violence and personal violence. Maybe they were never arrested, but maybe there was some personal violence in their past. But a lot of times in certain cases, I mean, I think what I've heard the most is they were controlling. That's what I seem to hear, that they were just controlling in some way, shape, or form. That's been my, kind of my personal experience after we find out, oh, somebody did this. And I'm not just talking about serial murders. I'm talking about other types of murders too. When you finally find the person who did it, that's what I've seen. But there's just no one thing that ever stands out. And very rarely are you going to say, oh, I knew it was him. You were talking, Brett, like, how does someone just go around and hide all this? Well, they do it all the time. And like in the cases you guys have talked about with the child pornography, I mean, every single time someone's arrested, you're like, not that guy. Gosh, he was the best guy. He directed our choir, I mean, our church choir. I mean, it is always these people that you just have absolutely no idea what's going on in their fantasy world.
We've all heard that, serial killers get started because they start killing animals as kids or something. And we've talked about this before, but like killing someone and having the wherewithal to be in control with all the cortisol that happens when something like that happens is not what the typical person experiences. The typical person will freak out, right? But that's not the case with someone who is able to carry through it multiple times, wrap a body, dispose of the body, live their portrayed successful life as if nothing happened, do it again. That kind of precision and expertise, how does a serial killer, specifically one who kills many times, arrive at that level? A surgeon is in residency for years, a decade, to be good at cutting someone open. How does a serial killer do that without messing up while they're learning to be a serial killer and be caught before they've perfected their craft?
I don't think that they don't mess up, and I don't think it's always perfect. I think there's a lot of mistakes made, and sometimes they never go as well as they probably fantasize about. So I do think they learn as they go. They get better. They perfect. Their MOs may change. As they, realize, okay, that didn't work. This worked better. They become better at what they do. I do think that happens in terms of like not getting stressed out about it or this, there is just something missing in somebody that can do that to another human being. It's like, I read a book once about psychopathy, and a psychopath or a diagnosed psychopath was talking about how he just was missing that feeling thing. And for them to cut up a body is no different than maybe carving a turkey. That's really how much they lack emotion and feeling for other people. They lack this ability to understand the pain of others, to walk in someone else's shoes. And this doesn't impact them the same way it would a normal person. It's why it's so hard for like us normal people to understand how someone can do this to somebody else and try to make sense of it. And like, how come he just acted so normal? And look at him, he's successful. He's an architect. He has a wife and kids. And how did we not know this? Is just because they can hide it so well. They're just not affected by it. They're not stressed by it.
So Jason in the comments has a great question. I want to ask you that. And I think it follows up on what you just said. I mean, given that whoever does this thinks in a different way and is a different kind of person and everything else, he's just been arrested. You have the opportunity to walk in there and conduct the first interview of him. How do you prepare to do that? What kind of interview are you conducting? What kind of questions are you asking? How are you getting at this person who something is so fundamentally different from the way everybody else thinks?
Well, I'm going to talk generally because what we would do in a case like this, and perhaps BAU was consulted on this, but we would want to know everything about him that we could possibly know before going into that interview. Like, what is important to him? That's what we do, and try to focus in on specific things about this person. What's going to matter to him? And then for somebody like this, what I would avoid, and I'm just being very general now because I don't really know who this guy is specifically because he was just arrested today. but I would avoid trying to play on his emotions or sympathy for the victims, or because that's just not what's probably going to matter to him. He's not really going to understand that. I would approach it as like, what's going to benefit him, because that's all that really matters in this. This offender, this person who did this to these victims, has no regard for anyone but himself. And we can never forget that. This is what he did. Back to the very simplest. And he's not going to care. He's not going to feel bad. He's not going to find religion or anything. Now, if he thinks it's going to benefit him in some way, if he starts like saying, I found religion, then play off that, then go with that. I mean, he may want to get a lighter sentence. He may decide, oh, I'll confess to these to benefit myself. But that's how I would approach it. And you're just, again, just very generally.
And what does matter to someone like that? Is it, the perception of success? I mean, he's been caught. So,
yes.
Are you being friends with him? Are you coming down with the hammer? Are you saying, hey, let's cut a deal. We can work together. What matters to them?
Well, it's hard to say what exactly matters to this person, but I think potentially his business could matter, how he's viewed. And in terms of, do you want to be viewed as this kind of killer? Or do you want to be viewed as this kind of killer? That could potentially matter to him. It could matter to him, like to get maybe a reduced sentence for cooperating if he were to, confess to these or to others. I mean, there's a lot of different things they could do that could potentially benefit him. But I think that's how, at least without knowing really specific things about him, it would be hard to really craft a really good interview. But I'm sure that whoever interviewed him went in there knowing every single thing. And I also think you'd ask, do we go in there really like hard or soft interview? I mean, I think it's just better to always just be cordial. I think that works the best. And not with everybody. There are times where I think being very forceful, it can work, but generally just being cordial is probably the best approach, just without knowing what he's going to react to. But, it would be good to know, how does he react when he's been in contact with a person in power? How does he behave or react? Or, is it important to send someone in there that's high ranking, so he's made to feel like he's really important? Or do you want to send someone in there that is, sort of pretending to be like, well, they're just sending me in here? Not that he'll buy that, but do you want to send someone in there that he thinks he can try to fool? And, at least get him talking. There's just a number of different ways to approach him. And without knowing for sure the best way, I would tend to think that just generally, he's probably has some arrogance. So perhaps sending someone in there higher ranking, showing him the respect he probably feels he deserves.
What about, like, I'm very curious about this, a man or a woman? Because we think we know his victims to be women. Do you think that would factor in? Would it throw him off if it was a woman who went in, a small woman? Or would you just play into maybe he's a very tall, large man, so maybe someone who matches him in kind? Do you have thoughts on something like that?
Mm-hmm. I guess I hadn't really thought about that, but I think before I would before I decide, okay, which gender, what are his relationships like with women that are not his victims? Like, how does he respond? What is his relationship like with his mother or things like that? I mean, despite what he has done, he may have decent relationships with women outside of his crimes. We just don't know. Or he may be very reluctant to talk to a woman, maybe might make him angry. It's just hard to say without knowing what his interpersonal relationships are like right now and in the past.
And that's fascinating. That's what you're saying. I know every person is different. And that was a selfish question, because I know I've been deployed many times to play the like innocent, dumb, small, unimposing woman, as opposed to kind of the more brawny FBI agents going in. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You're absolutely right about that.
You have to know that person. And you really do it, doing a really detailed interview strategy. You have to know about someone as much as you can. And for somebody like him, it might be a little difficult because, that requires asking questions of people that might know him. And I'm certainly, they don't want to do that at this point because someone could potentially tell him. But if you were to find somebody that you could question about him that was not going to tell him, and then just try to, determine like what's his pattern of life, what's he doing on the weekends and things like that, that might tell you a little bit about what his relationships are like just from observations. But it really is hard. And I think generally you just send your best interviewers in that you can and hope that that's the right fit for him.
Let me ask you this as we're sort of wrapping up, because you've already given us over an hour of your time. Knowing what you know about him, is there anything that surprises you?
No.
Well, there you have it.
That's why you are among the best behavioral analysts in the country. No, I truly mean that. And as you were talking, just your demeanor, I think you're absolutely right. I can see how you were probably a scarily good interviewer, because you lull me into a complete sense of I'll tell you anything. Absolutely. But I think this is so important for people to see, because oftentimes people think law enforcement, all they do is run inside of a room for an interview with a suspect and pound the tables. And that a lot of kind of law enforcement malfeasance comes from the beating the chest type of behavior. But I think you're showing us through the way that you're talking through and analyzing what we know about this case in your own demeanor, that that's not the best type of interviewing, and that's not how you get the most effective use of your time with someone who could hold all the information that you need. So I think that's, you're a great ambassador for really how these interviews should be conducted.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone in the chat and we could go on for hours, but like Brett said, you've given us so much of your time. This, I hope, is not our last conversation about this case or anything else, but I don't, we've asked so many questions and we've talked a lot. Is there anything else about this case, your time working on the case, or serial killers in general, that you'd like to add before we close out for the night?
Put me on the spot here.
Take your time.
So I think what I'd like to say is that there is no one profile of a serial killer. They are all different. Some of them have similar traits, as I've talked about. They tend to have a disregard for others, and they're superficial, and they tend to have very active fantasy lives. But that's kind of where the similarities stop. And so to try to say, oh, he's just like this serial killer, he's just like that you just can't do that. So they're all very different and my colleague Bob had always said, the only thing they have in common is that they're serial killers. And you really do have to look at each individual case and what happened, and who, what was the victim selection process like. And then once you've identified that person, you have to learn all the little unique things about that particular person in order to really truly understand who they are. So I think that's what I'll leave on.
And that is brilliant, like everything else you've talked about tonight. Brett, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just, everybody, Julia will be back soon to talk about whether Adnan really did it. We can't wait to have her on for that episode. Not going to ask her tonight, but everybody look forward to that one.
Yes. Julia, thank you so much for just being so generous with your time and your questions, and for being an advocate for behavioral analysis, the correct kind, and correcting Brett when he completely misunderstands an entire field. We are all better for it. So I do hope that people will go listen to the consult with Julia Cowley. You've heard her here. If you haven't heard her previous episode on Legal Briefs, you have got to check it out. It is an amazing episode, and I can really say that because I'm not on it at all. It's all Julia. So go listen to the consult, because I know I can't get enough of Julia. And Julia, thank you again for being generous with your time and for all you do, all you've done in your career to stop people like who we have here today. It cannot be overstated, because I can't imagine the toll it takes to do that type of work day in and day out and put yourself in the mind of kind of the most depraved in our society. So thank you for your service to our society as well. But with all that said, I'm sure this is not the last time we're going to talk about the Long Island serial killer. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the prosecutor's legal briefs. I'm going to give you a little bit of humble pie. Oh, yeah. So I have 2 baby monitors with me watching 3 of my kids.
Wow. So this could go horribly wrong at any moment is what you're saying.
No, this is going to go great is all I'm saying. I'm just saying if you see like my eyebrows moving weird, it's not you, it's the baby monitor.
I remember those days.
Oh, you say they pass?
They do, and they go really fast, and the next thing you know, they're in college.
Oh.
No,
If you say
don't
so.
say it. Don't say it.
I dreaded the day for 18 years.
Aw.